So Jack has had a long and deep involvement with North Korea, and we're delighted he's here.
You know, I was sitting there, I've got some slides I left at the end, assuming I had some time left, in which I was going to show you that would give you a little bit of sense about North Korea. But if I can work the graphics here, I'm going to do it exactly backwards. I think it'll be important for you to get a sense of the environment and what we're talking about. So let's see if I can go backwards. It doesn't want to go backwards to the end of the thing. All right, well, no, yeah, here we go. Here we go. I love this slide. This is the original leader that founded the country, Kim Il-sung, a statue of President Kim Il-sung. I have an asterisk up there. And I have another version in which I talk about the relationship between the current leader, Kim Jong-il, and his father, who this statue is. Kim Jong-il, the current leader, is not the president of North Korea. His father is. Now, his father died in 1994. I've seen his father on 2 occasions. In 2000, I went with his Secretary Albright, and we visited the body. We went to the presidential office, and he's in a glass coffin there, and you go by and you see him. And I went a few years later there. But I often think that Kim Jong-il, who we think is a little off, is probably not. He consults with his father. He goes and he says, "Mr. President, I'm thinking about doing the following things. If you object, please tell me." Juche Tower. Juche means self-reliance, so they're big on that. This is why they ask for food aid. This was erected, now it's 25 years ago. But there's an importance in the information up here, 558 feet. Anybody know the height of the Washington Monument? 555, yeah, it's 555. 25,550 blocks. Now, what they did not do is build this and count the blocks. They counted the blocks and then built it. 25,550 blocks represents, when this was dedicated, each day for the 70 years that Kim Il-sung was alive for his birthday. Very deliberate there. Every classroom, every office, every anything has leadership pictures. And I don't know why they don't ever update this. These pictures are about 150 years old. Kim Il-sung on the left, the current leader, Kim Jong-il on the right. This is a classroom of students all over the place. So I want you to get a sense of, you can't walk down the street without, as this woman is trying not to look over her shoulder, without having not big brother, but grandfather and son looking over your shoulder here. Now, this type of propaganda is also everywhere, on the street corners. And what's worse, 3 or 4 years ago, I went to the #1 middle school in Pyongyang, in North Korea. And I'm walking down the halls looking at these kind of posters. This is what kids are growing up with, this kind of stuff. There was one that I saw in which there was an American Jeep overturned with a North Korean using a bayonet on that. Now, this is interesting, and you may have seen in the opening video that we had, there was a brief shot of something like this, not exactly this, but from the same instance. And let me give you the sense of this. In 2000, when Secretary Albright went to meet with Kim Jong-il, we'd been meeting all day long, and at the end of the day, he said, I know what your schedule is, but I have something special for you. And so just meet me at the May 5th Stadium. And so we go to a stadium, like a football stadium, an enclosure there. And we drive up, there are no cars, there's no buses. It's completely dark, it's silent. And I'm thinking, we got the wrong instructions. We went to the wrong May 5th. This is probably the May 4th stadium. We walk through the tunnel, and Kim Jong-il meets us as he's coming through, and he's walking us in. As soon as we come up to, the interior of that, a spotlight hits Kim Jong-il, and 150,000 people erupt. Now, you've been a very good audience, but you haven't been perfect. You know, we didn't ask you to walk here from Portland. You know, and I was stunned that the discipline. He seats Albright, and he goes like this, 150,000 people, sit down, and they're quiet. And then we proceeded to watch a performance that, now there's not 100,000 people on the floor of the stadium at any one time. There's only about 20 or 25,000. But throughout the it turned out to be 100,000 performers. There's 250,000 people in the stadium. The city is only 2 million people. They all walked to get there. You see this signage in the background there? That's 10,000 students holding placards. And there are, I don't know how many scenes, 20 or 30 of these scenes, and they are immediately, they come up and they change. And when I first got there, I'm going, wow, look at that, how automated that is. And they said, no, 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 those are students with colored cards. It was absolutely amazing. All right, well, let me see if I can go back to, let's go start my presentation. So I wanted to give you a sense, there we go, of what North Korea is like from a North Korean's perspective. It is about the leadership. And obviously, you see and this is an important point. That's almost a 900-kilometer border between China and North Korea. It's very important. We've got a slide later, or I've got a slide later, and it will emphasize where the DMZ is, the difference, the change between the north and the south here along there, and that'll become important a little bit later. But here's what I want to talk about, or why it's important that we're going to talk about that. And the first one for me is the most important. I don't wake up in the middle of the night waiting for North Korea to use a nuclear weapon. I am concerned of where the technology, the fissile material, the know-how, the scientists, where they're going to end up. And unfortunately, we've had a situation in which proliferation has occurred, and we found out about it collectively in September of 2007 when we woke up to hear about the Israeli Air Force bombing a Syrian nuclear facility that was being secretly constructed in the desert. Well, that facility, the technology, the know-how, and some of the scientists were North Korean. And of course, we're concerned about the military threat to our allies there in the region. They do have an atrocious human rights record. But equally important is, so what happens when this regime collapses? There are consequences that a lot of people are very much concerned with. So what I want to do is to take a look, kind of a snapshot, last 2.5 or 3 years of what's been going on in North Korea, and to give you a sense of maybe why, at least from my analytical perspective, and what we might look for in the future as we take a look at this beast. Now, you know, I have got a kind of a parallel to the original title here, kind of a subtitle, and it's a parallel to the real estate mantra, location, location, location. Well, in North Korea, for the last 3 years, and what's going to happen, at least in the near term, it is succession, succession, succession. What's going to happen when Kim Jong-il, there he is, dies? He's been the leader now, coming up on 17 years. But more importantly, is what happens when he leaves the scene. In August of 2008, he suffered a stroke. You know, regular picture on the left, a picture several months after a stroke, one that I love there because these were released by the North Koreans. And I thought, what idiot public relations guy would have him standing by something that looks like a walker? Now, it's a pool there. But they released this to show how healthy he was. And I thought, you know, somebody needs a new job. Now, when this stroke happened, they had no plan in place. Who's going to be the next leader? In contrast, when he took over in 1994, his father before him had been grooming him for more than 20 years. He had been in senior positions, and he had been there for quite a while. He was effectively making the day-to-day decisions in North Korea when his father died on the 8th of July, 1994. Yet, when he came to power, there was about a 3-year period that he declared himself to be in mourning, but in fact, he was consolidating his power. And so we're going to fast forward to the guy almost died. And what's the longevity now? You know, he very well could die at any point in time, and it will not surprise anyone. So who's going to take over for him? North Korea was really very much in a panic. And it helps to explain what began a very chilly relationship with the United States. At the end of the Bush administration, towards the end of 2008, the administration was pushing the North Koreans hard in the six-party process, trying to come up with those final agreements that would create some sense of progress, some sense of legacy, but in practical terms, they were looking for a verification protocol with the North Koreans in which we could rely on a means in which to check up on North Korea. If they said this, we could go there and look. The North Koreans are now reeling because of this. Any attempt at compromise by their negotiators would not have worked. The regime was very vulnerable, and any sense that anything other than a nationalistic response by the team that was temporarily in charge is about the only thing that we could expect. So at the end of the Bush administration, while we're pushing for these things, we're doing incentives. The North Koreans had been on what's called the Trading with the Enemy Act, TWIA, since 1950, the outbreak of the Korean War. These are economic sanctions in place against North Korea. Part of those were lifted after a missile moratorium deal with the North Koreans in 1999 and 2000, but a lot of them remained in place. They wanted off of those, but they also wanted something else, and that was to be removed from the bad boy list, and that is the state sponsor of terrorism list, for which there is only 6 or 7 countries now on them. We've taken Libya off. And so the administration said, all right, if you do this deal, we'll lift the sanctions, we'll take you off the terrorism list. And the North Koreans said, no thanks, we're walking away. And so the administration's response was, at this point in time, okay, well, let's reverse that. Let's take you off the list and remove the sanctions. And the North Koreans' response was, in this environment, thank you. And that was the end of the six-party talks. We have not met with them in over 2 years. Now, what occurred in this environment is the North Koreans are scrambling to find and put in place something that will preserve the regime. And as they see the results of the election, they're anticipating Barack Obama will be much more like the end of the Clinton administration. The end of the Clinton administration for the North Koreans was a relatively good period. It promised better relationships. When Bush came in, the North Koreans didn't know how to handle that. And so they were looking forward to Barack Obama coming in. Unfortunately, they were moving towards a missile launch, part of a feel-good, domestic, need something nationalistic to be proud of. We're going to launch a missile. We're going to put a satellite in orbit. The Obama administration coming in was looking at this without their full team in place and saying, the North Koreans are testing us. They're being provocative. And so, you know, we're going to be tough on them. The North Koreans launched that missile on the 5th of April, 2009. The reaction by the United States was, you have done something bad, and we're going to fix your wagon here. The United States led an effort in the United Nations that came forward with a presidential statement condemning North Korea for this missile launch. North Korea was stunned. They thought they had done everything perfectly correct. Now, let me take you back a few years. On July 4th, 2006, the North Koreans launched a long-range missile. The international community also was upset. It led to sanctions, a UN Security Council Resolution 1695. But it was probably the Chinese description at the time to the North Koreans that said, it's not that you launched the missile, it's that you didn't do it correctly. You failed to notify the international community. You failed to set up closure zones so the debris wouldn't hit ships. You wouldn't disrupt air traffic. And so you disturbed the peace in the environment of the region. The North Koreans, in preparation for this April 2009 launch, made the announcements, closed the areas, joined the International Space Treaty, thinking that they had learned their lessons. And obviously, they didn't. The Security Council essentially said, I don't know how clear it was to you in 2006, but what we really meant to tell you was, of all the nations in the world, you alone do not have the right to peaceful use of space. And therefore, your launch in April was a violation of the 2006 sanctions. The North Koreans, as I say, were stunned. Their reaction was to explain what occurred 6 weeks later, on the 25th of May, 2009, a second nuclear detonation. Now, clearly, you don't respond out of anger that you've had your hand slapped and then detonate a nuclear device. It takes a little bit longer. That was already probably all in their plans, again, associated with this. So we had the missile launch on April 5th. That is their picture of their launch. It led to the nuclear device, this launch, UN Security Council Resolution 1874, which I think for the very first time set aside actual sanctions that had meaning. It was simply much more than what we have done in the past. I remember when I first went to work at the White House, and we were going through one after another sanctioning North Korea for some missile launch. And I asked my friends in the non-proliferation arena, so what are these sanctions that we've imposed on North Korea for a 2-year period? And they said, because of what the North Koreans have done, they will not be eligible for a DoD military contract for the next 2 years. I said, very effective, very effective. Well, 1874 doesn't do that. It assigns responsibilities to the rest of the international community, in which we all have, each member nation has responsibilities to track suspect North Korean illegal cargo, to seize that cargo, to dispose of that cargo, etc. And I think for the first time that the North Koreans at that point in time, in the summer of 2009, began to be concerned about the path that they were headed. Now, the sanctions were not physically affecting them to much of a degree, but they didn't like where they were going. And we had this window of opportunity to do something. But then something happened that involved our friends, the Chinese, and that was Premier Wen Jiaobao's visit to North Korea in October to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the relationship between the two. And in terms of the protocol of this relationship and what this meeting was, the Chinese came with a small gift basket of $200 million worth of projects, aid, and things of that nature. What that did was to signal to the North Koreans, at least this is the way they read it, was don't worry about the 1874 sanctions because there's a loophole. And your lifeline will be there with China. That was, unfortunately, a very difficult time, and we've not really recovered from that. So what we have now is the North Koreans trying in an accelerated fashion to find ways to ensure the survivability of the regime. One of the things that they did was to take the brother-in-law, Jong Taek, seen here, and change the Constitution, expand the National Defense Commission. This is the governmental organization, the military side, that runs the decision-making process in North Korea. They expanded it from 8 military people, I think, or 7 to about 12, and for the first time put a civilian, the brother-in-law, on there. We see this and we say, okay, they're preparing the future where a Kim member of the family will be there even if the Kim, who is the chairman, is gone. Several months later, in June of 2009, he's promoted to vice chairman of that committee. So he is now in place to do that. There's a number of things that are going wrong in North Korea. They tried at the end of that year for a currency revaluation, just kind of lopped off some zeros off their currency and told the people, tomorrow, if this is in effect, anything that you hold is kind of worthless. That didn't go over well. Now, there were no riots, but it was so disruptive and disturbing that the North Koreans eventually walked that back. Now, what I like to think of when I think of Kim Jong-il is Fred McMurray. It's a natural thought. I'll explain. Fred McMurray, for a lot of his acting career, was associated with a television program, My Three Sons. Likewise, Kim Jong-il has 3 sons. He went through a process of trying to figure out who was going to be the next successor. And in Oriental culture, there is no choice. It's the older son. Now, the older son, Kim Jong-nam, around 2002, decided, I've won the equivalent of the Super Bowl, I'm going to Disneyland. Well, he couldn't get to Florida, so he thought he would go to Tokyo. So he, his son, the nanny, girlfriend, wife, a couple other people, decided that they would waltz into Tokyo, go to Tokyo Disneyland. The only problem is that they decided they looked a lot like Dominican Republicans. And so they had false passports of Dominican Republicans. Now that got them from the immigration gate to the immigration special office. The father was not happy. So he went down to son number 2. And they were going to what Kim Jong-il does on a very regular basis. He does on-the-spot inspections. He goes out and he tells the experts how to do stuff. That's another story. And he goes by the middle son's room and he says, are you ready? And the middle son says, hey, Pops, hey, Fred, what do you think? Which dress do I look best in? It's reported that the son has some effeminate qualities. And so the father said, nah, I don't think so. Let's go to son number 3. This may be Chip in the Fred McMurray series. And so Chip, Kim Jong-un, is probably 26 years old. At least that's what the South Koreans think. Next year, he'll be 30. Next year, it's a very special year. The president turns 100. And I guess he'll just still be laying there. Kim Jong-il turns 70. So there's a need here for some parallel here. So the next youngest son's got to be 30. It doesn't matter that he's only 26. Things have happened in 2010. Now I'm back on the serious side here that I need to talk about for just a little while. That tries to explain why 2010 was a very bad year for North Korea and the South Korean relationship. On the 26th of March, 2010, the South Korean naval ship, a corvette called the Cheonan, was operating in its own waters up what we call the northern limit line, and I'm going to get to that in just a second. It was sunk by what an investigation later declared to be a North Korean torpedo. My sense is that the North Koreans were having a particularly bad year. Dresses weren't looking good on the middle son. They had a previous series of things that I'll talk about a little bit in detail. They were ready for something. They needed some domestic good news. They needed a military victory in an area in which they've had military defeats. And I think that in part explains why this occurred, a very strange occurrence. But what we saw afterwards are these rumors and pieces of information coming out of North Korea that began assigning to the young son, Kim Jong-un, 26-year-old, the planning and the execution of this marvelous military victory. They were giving him the credentials to be associated with the military. Oh, am I there already? Okay. Well, let me just, this is important because in November, 3 months ago, I was in North Korea. I had asked to go to the nuclear facility at Yeongpyeon. I'd been there 7 years earlier with Dr. Sig Hecker, who was the director of the Los Alamos National Laboratory. I was more interested in the current state of their plutonium facilities, things that we thought were under control. I got there and they said, well, you already know about that other stuff. We want to tell you what we've been doing lately. Now, as I was moving into to North Korea, you may have seen some of the intelligence reporting or at least comments on that there was some construction going on at this facility in North Korea. We didn't know what it was there. We had overhead satellites. And so when I was there, they brought in one of their directors from their Atomic Energy Bureau from Pyongyang. We went to the site, and he said, I'm here to tell you that we're building that what you guys are looking at is a light water reactor under construction. So I'm the first American. They're telling me it's, in reality, it's not a big deal because it would have been a matter, I think, of days before the intelligence community would have been able to figure out what they were doing. They told me about it. We went out and we looked at the site. I'm busy trying to take measurements so I can call back and tell everybody what it is. But in this conversation, I'm getting bits and pieces of information about a uranium facility at Yeongpyeon. And so I get this all together in bits and pieces, and I say, you're telling me you have a low enriched uranium facility here at Yeongpyeon? And they said, yes. We had never known that before. I went back to Pyongyang that evening, met with the Director General of North American Affairs, and I said, this is what I've been told, this is what you have. And he was stunned that I had gotten this information. And I said, this is precisely why you need to bring back the International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors, or else you are going to be headed down a path that Iran is on. That is going to be very unfortunate for you. You need to invite them in. Or at the very least, I knew that Dr. Hecker, that I had been there with 7 years ago, was going to come in a week after me. I said, at the very least, you've got to take him to this facility and show him. Because if you're declaring it to be a fuel facility rather than a high enrichment facility, the difference being for fuel, you enrich it to 3.5% or thereabouts. For a weapon, it's above 80, almost 90% to create a weapon. If it's not what we may suspect it is, you better have people there. They allowed Hecker in, and the world reaction was, aha, you did something bad again, and so we're going to punish you. And so we're on that path now. Another incident that occurred on the negative side happened on the 23rd of November this past year. For the first time since the end of the Korean War, North Korean artillery shells landed on sovereign South Korean territory. The results were 2 South Korean military men were killed, but 2 civilians were killed. It changed the tone in South Korea about what to do with North Korea. So, this is part of, let me see if I can get, yeah, here we go. This is, I think, answers or attempts to answer a lot of things. Now, this, maybe not. Anyway, you can see by the box between the difference of the red and the blue there, where the land boundary is. But the sea boundary does not exist. We could not, at the end of the Korean War, come up with an acceptable, agreed-upon boundary that would have extended the natural contours of the land boundary, because In this West Sea, above or just below this dotted line now, are 5 South Korean islands. So had that line been extended in a natural way, those islands would have been north, in North Korean territory. So the UN commander at the time, an American general, artificially drew this line and declared it to be a northern limit line to protect those southern islands. The North Koreans are not happy about this. This is a terrific fishing area, crabbing area. There have been some serious incidents in this area, as I've indicated here. It's 23 November. 5 weeks later, on the 1st of January, we get a joint editorial by the North Koreans that said, let's be friends. Let's start talking. Let's not be fighting in the sandbox anymore. And oh, by the way, we're going to concentrate on the light industry. And you're going, wait a minute, we've just had 2 incidents, serious incidents this year. 50 South Koreans were killed, an attack on the sovereign territory of South Korea. 5 weeks later, the North saying, okay, let's just be friends. The explanation that I want to give you, and then we'll go into a wrap-up here, is that for North Korea, 2010 was a very bad year. Economically, they were going through the succession planning, designating folks, trying to do a number of things that were unsettling to them. They had been defeated the year before in a naval exercise. They were looking for something there. That's been done. They got a lot of pushback by their neighbors, and to include, they embarrassed the Chinese. Because when these incidents occurred, particularly the sinking of the Cheonan, the reaction by the Chinese almost caused a rupture in the relationship with South Korea. But from a Chinese point of view, it signifies their concern about the fragility of the North Korean regime. And for the Chinese, as we heard today, when you get below 6% of growth, that's not good for the leadership. Well, instability along their border, inability to continue the economic progress associated with that, the flocking of migrants back and forth, or a flooding of refugees, is not there. So when the Chinese take a look in terms of, yes, we want to denuclearize North Korea, but we also have our own national security concerns about our own well-being. When you weigh them, it always wins that their national security top priority will go. They don't like what's going on. They push the North Koreans to the limit that they can, but it is insufficient to do that. I need to move fast, if I may. So let's take a look at what's going to happen. What I say, which is different from what you hear most people, in South Korea, other analysts will say, ooh, you got to watch out for more provocations by North Korea. I'm not quite sure that that's what's going to happen. I've been saying for the last several weeks that I think 2011 is going to be a far less provocative and tense situation. Why? Because the North Koreans in 2010 accomplished what they needed to do. They ascribed to the 26-year-old, I don't think I've gotten to him yet. Well, I did. I passed him up. You already saw him then. And I think that's important. If I can go back. Oops. Anyway, I'll get to it. It's important that the 26-year-old has some legitimacy. So in September and October, he was promoted to the vice chairman of the Central Military Commission on the party side. His father said, well, we've got to give him some overt military credentials. Now, we've done a couple bad things in the North Koreans for which he's getting credit for, but he's surrounded by 70 and 80-year-old generals. Let's make him a 4-star. So like this 24-year-old civilian is now a 4-star. But just to make sure that he was in good company, Kim Chung-il made his sister a 4-star general as well. My point is, I think a lot of things have been put in place, and that for North Korea, as I mentioned, 2012 is a very important year. They want to celebrate the 100th birth of their original leader and declare it to be themselves to be a strong and prosperous nation. To do that, they better start lowering the tension and focus on what they had hoped to do and draw in foreign direct investments there. They cannot do that if they continue this type of provocation. And I also think that the Chinese have, in fact, played a very important role. You know, when Hu Jintao came to Washington in January, the president was ready to say, you need to do more with North Korea. But in fact, Hu Jintao was able to say, didn't you read the 1 January joint editorial statement? They want to be friends. We did that. Pressure's off the Chinese for a while. So things that you can look at this year, and this is what I like to do, is to leave you with, here's what's been going on, here's maybe why it's happened, but here's things that you can look for in your newspaper, in the news, etc. The North Koreans are, in fact, they are on an overture of trying to find ways to patch up things with South Korea. But in fact, they really want bilateral meetings with the United States. The United States, and in the Q&A we can get into U.S. policy on this, really has been saying, no, fix it with South Korea first, we're not talking to you. But there could be. You might have a restart of six-party talks, which have been off since October of 2008, but there's not going to be any real movement towards denuclearization, which is the purpose of the six-party talks. The North Koreans have essentially declared nuclear weapons are off the table. They're not going to talk about them. But you may find, because a number of nations believe there's some utility in having a discussion going on, that when the North Koreans are talking, they're less likely to be provocative, at least the Chinese view on that. And they are going to try to focus on economic activity in hopes of turning things around to some degree that allows them to declare victory in 2012 on their movement towards an economic development. But mostly, everything that's going to be happening last year and this year is going to be associated with continued preparation for the change in leadership whenever that may come, the succession from Kim Jong-il to his 26, soon-to-be 30-year-old son. So let me stop there. Thank you.